My administration will be reclaiming the Panama Canal, and we've already started doing it.
Every year, thousands of ships carrying everything from cars and electronics to food and fuel pass through a narrow waterway in Central America, the Panama Canal. It is one of the most important pieces of infrastructure ever built, shortening global trade routes by thousands of miles and connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through a single engineering marvel. But the country most responsible for its existence doesn't own it. The United States spent decades pursuing the canal, and for much of the 20th century, America effectively controlled the territory surrounding it. Yet today, the canal belongs to Panama. So why would a nation go to such extraordinary lengths to build one of the most strategically valuable assets on Earth, only to give up control of it? This is a story of engineering ambition, political intrigue, disease, and a century-long struggle over sovereignty. This is the story of why America paid for the world's most important canal and why it doesn't own it. The story of a canal on the Isthmus of Panama begins in 1848. That is when gold was discovered in California. Within months, tens of thousands of people from the eastern United States were trying to get there. But the journey to get there was anything but straightforward. Travelers either had to cross a deadly desert that took months, or disembark through 75 miles of jungle on the Atlantic side. The other option was to travel through the Cape Horn, a route that covered more than 13,000 miles around the tip of South America. In bad weather, it took up to 8 months. Ships rounded the bottom of a continent through some of the most violent seas on Earth. Passengers packed into overcrowded vessels, rationing food, watching for scurvy, praying the weather held. A journey from New York to San Francisco by that route covered 14,000 nautical miles. The same journey through Panama today covers 5,200. The gold rush didn't just move people, it moved the problem of American geography into sharp focus for the first time. The United States had just won a war with Mexico and acquired California, New Mexico, and most of the American Southwest. It was now a continental nation, Atlantic coast to Pacific coast, but its two coastlines were separated by an entire continent with no railroad crossing it yet. Goods, troops, mail, people, everything moving between east and west faced that same brutal terrain. The U.S. Navy felt it more acutely than anyone. A naval power that cannot move its fleet between its two coasts without a months-long voyage around South America is not truly a naval power. It is two separate, weaker fleets. If war broke out on the Pacific while the Atlantic fleet was in port, there was no quick way to respond. The Cape Horn voyage took around 55 days, even under good conditions. In a military emergency, 55 days was a lifetime. The idea of cutting through the narrow strip of land connecting North and South America was not new. Spanish explorers had identified the Isthmus of Panama as a potential crossing point in the 16th century. Various proposals had circulated for decades, but the gold rush gave the idea an urgency it hadn't had before. By the 1870s, American commerce was expanding rapidly. The Transcontinental Railroad had connected the coasts by land in 1869, but shipping by sea remained cheaper and more practical for heavy goods. The problem was that American ships moving between east and west coast ports still had to choose between the Panama land crossing and the Cape Horn route. As American trade volumes grew, the inefficiency became increasingly expensive. For a growing industrial economy that needed to shift between its coasts, a canal was the only real answer. But the Americans were not the only ones who had figured that out. In 1869, France had just completed the Suez Canal, and it was lauded as one of the greatest megaprojects in history. More than 1.5 million workers had taken part in building a 100-mile waterway that cut through the Egyptian desert connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. The project took 10 years to build and transformed global shipping overnight. The man behind the Suez Canal, Ferdinand de Lesseps, became the most celebrated engineer in the world. He was the man who had bent geography to human will. Emboldened by that success, de Lesseps turned his attention to Panama in the late 1870s. He projected the canal would take less than 10 years to complete and would be much simpler. Investors who had made fortunes on Suez piled in. The French public, riding the credibility of the greatest engineering achievement of the century, subscribed enthusiastically. De Lesseps raised 1.5 billion francs from roughly 800,000 French retail investors. Construction began in 1881, but the builders quickly realized that Panama was not Egypt. De Lesseps had decided on a sea-level canal, no locks, just a straight cut through the isthmus at ocean level, the same approach that had worked in Egypt. The problem was that Panama was not Egypt. The terrain between the Atlantic and Pacific coasts was not flat desert but dense jungle sitting on top of a mountain range. The Culebra Cut, the section through the Continental Divide, required excavating through rock and unstable soil to a depth that made the Suez Canal look like a drainage ditch. Then there was the water. Panama receives around 2.5 meters of rain annually. The Chagres River, running directly across the proposed canal route, flooded with a violence during wet season that repeatedly overwhelmed the excavation sites, washing away equipment and work in hours that had taken weeks to complete. De Lesseps's engineers dug. The jungle and the rain filled it back in, and then people started dying. Yellow fever and malaria moved through the workforce with a speed that no one had fully anticipated. The actual death toll from the French effort remains disputed. Estimates run from 20,000 to as high as 22,000 workers dead over the course of the project, most from disease rather than accidents. The French tried to keep the scale of the mortality quiet. The workers arriving to replace the dead often didn't know what had happened to the men before them. There was never enough of the right equipment for mountain terrain. The machinery that had worked in Egypt was useless against the Culebra mountain range. Landslides undid weeks of excavation overnight. The rain-soaked hillsides simply collapsed back into the cuts as fast as they could be dug. The jungle grew back over abandoned equipment. The mud and heat were constant, and the death toll climbed without pause. By the mid-1880s, the financial reality was becoming impossible to hide. The cost estimates had been catastrophically wrong from the beginning. The company began issuing new bonds to keep the work going. The company knew it was failing, and it was managing the public's awareness of that failure to keep the money coming in. When that stopped working, they turned to bribery. 104 members of the French Chamber of Deputies were bribed to support the project and approve additional bond issues. The engineer Gustave Eiffel, who had just completed the Eiffel Tower, was brought in as a contractor and became entangled in the scandal. The company was not just failing, it was committing one of the largest financial frauds in European history, using the money of 800,000 ordinary French investors to prop up a project that its own leadership knew could not succeed. All work on the canal ceased in 1889. The French company declared bankruptcy. Around 20,000 workers had died. $262 million had been spent, the equivalent of roughly $9 billion today, with nothing to show but a partially excavated trench filled with rainwater and the rusting hulks of machinery being swallowed by the jungle. Criminal trials followed where de Lesseps and his son were convicted of fraud. De Lesseps escaped prison on health grounds and died in 1894, his earlier triumph at Suez permanently overshadowed by what had happened in Panama. The jungle closed back over the site, the equipment rusted, and the question of who would finish what France had started began to linger. It wasn't long before the U.S. stepped in to fulfill a decades-old ambition. When the French walked away from Panama in 1889, they left behind something valuable. Yes, the canal was a flooded trench in a jungle, but the excavation work was still there. Whoever wanted to finish what France had started would inherit a partially dug route, surveyed terrain, and a legal framework for the work. That inheritance had a price, and America was willing to pay it. The Spanish-American War of 1898 had made the strategic argument for a canal impossible to ignore any further. The USS Oregon, a battleship stationed on the Pacific coast, received orders to join the Atlantic Fleet for action in Cuba. It took 68 days to make the journey around Cape Horn. By the time it arrived, the naval engagement it had been sent to support was nearly over. The episode became a national embarrassment and a strategic wake-up call. A country that needed 68 days to move a warship between its own two coasts was vulnerable in ways that no amount of military spending could fix without a canal. Theodore Roosevelt arrived at the presidency in 1901 with the canal near the top of his agenda. The question wasn't whether to build it, but where. Nicaragua was the other candidate, offering a flatter route with existing lakes that could reduce the excavation required. Congress was leaning toward Nicaragua. Then the French company that held the Panama rights, still trying to recover something from the wreckage of de Lesseps's disaster, dramatically cut its asking price from $109 million to $40 million. That's when Congress switched to Panama. But there was still a huge obstacle left. Panama was part of Colombia. In early 1903, the United States and Colombia negotiated the Hay-Herran Treaty, which would have granted Washington a 99-year lease to a canal zone. Roosevelt considered the deal done. The Colombian Senate rejected it, attempting to force the United States to significantly increase its lease payment. Colombia had watched France pour $262 million into Panamanian soil and wanted a larger share of what was coming next. Roosevelt's response was not to negotiate harder. Instead, the U.S. decided to back a decades-long independence struggle. Panama had been trying to separate from Colombia on and off for decades. The region had its own distinct identity, its own economic interests tied to the transit route across the isthmus, and a long history of resentment toward the government in Bogotá making decisions for Panamanians without Panamanian input. Between 1830 and 1840 alone, there had been 3 Panamanian attempts at independence. The independence movement didn't need to be invented, it needed to be encouraged. In October 1903, Roosevelt sent warships to Panama's coasts. On November 2nd, U.S. Navy captains were ordered to land Marines, seize the Panama Railroad, and block Colombian reinforcements. The railroad was the only practical route through the jungle. Without it, Colombian troops had no way to move quickly to suppress a revolt. Colombian troops were unable to negotiate the jungles of the Darien Gap. On November 3rd, Panamanian revolutionaries declared independence. The revolt was, by the standards of independence movements, remarkably bloodless. The Colombian forces that might have stopped it couldn't get through. The U.S. Navy was in the water. Roosevelt recognized the new Panamanian government immediately. The treaty that followed was negotiated and signed within 2 weeks of independence, a timeline that says something about how thoroughly it had been prepared in advance. The United States found a representative to broker the deal in Philippe Bonavarilla, a French engineer who had been involved in the original de Lesseps attempt, who had not lived in Panama for 17 years, and who had no legal authority to act on behalf of the Panamanian government. He signed anyway. The treaty gave the United States a 10-mile wide strip of land for the canal, in exchange for a one-time payment of $10 million to Panama and an annual annuity of $250,000. The United States also guaranteed Panamanian independence, the independence it had just helped engineer 2 weeks earlier. America got permanent control of the canal zone, and Panama got a country. Roosevelt later said of the whole episode, "I took the canal zone and let Congress debate." Whether it was a legitimate act of diplomacy or something closer to the manufacture of a convenient nation is a question that stays debated to this day. But when all was said and done, construction began on arguably the world's most challenging abandoned construction site. The Americans arrived in Panama in 1904 to find a graveyard. The French had left behind rusting equipment half swallowed by jungle, flooded excavations, and tens of thousands of graves in the soil they had been trying to move. The partially dug trench that de Lesseps's workers had carved through the Continental Divide before the money ran out was filled with water and vegetation. The infrastructure the French had built was rotting in the humidity. The first chief engineer, John Wallace, spent most of his tenure trying to organize imported equipment and a workforce that was terrified of what had killed the last one. A yellow fever outbreak in the Canal Administration Building in 1905 sent 3/4 of the American administrative staff home. Laborers often didn't have the right tools, and railroad spikes were being driven with axes. A year into the American effort, the project was a disorganized mess. Wallace was summoned to Washington and fired. His replacement was John Stevens, a railroad engineer who had built rail lines through some of the most demanding terrain in North America. Stevens looked at what was in front of him and made a decision that defined everything that followed. He stopped digging. Before another cubic yard of earth moved, Stevens reorganized the entire operation from the ground up. He rebuilt the Panama Railroad, which would become the logistical spine of the construction. The system that moved excavated material away from the dig sites fast enough for work to continue, and he gave a U.S. Army physician named William Gorgas the resources and authority to do what he had been asking to do since the Americans arrived. Gorgas had a theory that the French had not taken seriously enough because the science behind it was still new. Yellow fever and malaria were not caused by bad air or swamp vapors. They were transmitted by mosquitoes. Specific mosquitoes, ones that bred in standing water, the same standing water that the French had been creating everywhere across the canal zone. Gorgas and his team drained sources of standing water across the entire canal zone, applied larvicides, and installed window screens on every building. They fumigated homes. They sprayed crude oil mixed with kerosene on pools and puddles to smother mosquito larvae. They deployed 4,000 workers on disease eradication, and by 1906, yellow fever was effectively eradicated from the canal zone. The French had spent 9 years and lost 20,000 workers to diseases that, by the time the Americans arrived, medicine had just figured out how to prevent. The canal only became buildable once someone won that battle first. With the disease campaign under control and the logistics reorganized, the engineering could begin in earnest. And the engineering was staggering. The central problem was the Continental Divide. The mountains running through Panama rose hundreds of feet above sea level, and they had to be cut through. The Culebra Cut, a 9-mile artificial valley carved through the Continental Divide, required excavating over 100 million cubic yards of earth. Workers blasted the rock face with dynamite, loaded the debris onto rail cars, and moved it to where it was needed elsewhere on the route. For 7 years, the Culebra Cut was never silent, not even for an hour. At peak activity, a dynamite charge was being detonated somewhere in the cut every few minutes. The landslides were the thing that broke men's spirits. The rain-saturated hillsides didn't stay where they were cut. They slid back into the trench, sometimes slowly, sometimes in massive sudden collapses that buried equipment and undid months of work in minutes. Deadly landslides occurred without warning, becoming larger and more frequent as the excavation deepened, destroying machinery and reversing momentum. The engineers adjusted. They widened the cut, reduced the slope of the walls, and changed the excavation approach. The mountain kept sliding. At the Atlantic end of the canal, a different kind of engineering challenge was being solved. The canal didn't just need a route through the mountains, it also needed enormous quantities of water to fill the locks that would lift ships from sea level up over the divide and back down the other side. The solution was the Gatun Dam, built across the Chagres River. When completed in 1913, Gatun Lake was the largest man-made lake in the world. The dam that created it was the largest earth dam ever built at that point. A structure nearly 1.5 miles wide, holding back a body of water that covered 164 square miles. The lock system was the mechanical centerpiece. 3 sets of locks, at Gatun on the Atlantic side and at Pedro Miguel and Miraflores on the Pacific side, would lift ships 85 feet above sea level into Gatun Lake, carry them across the divide, and lower them back down to the ocean on the other side. Each lock chamber was 1,000 feet long and 110 feet wide, large enough to fit most of the ships in the world at the time, with room to spare. The concrete poured to build them was the largest single concrete construction project in history up to that point. At its peak, tens of thousands of workers were on site, the vast majority of them black men recruited from the West Indies, particularly Barbados and Jamaica, doing the most dangerous work, digging in the Culebra Cut, laying rail, handling dynamite, clearing jungle. They worked in tropical heat, in constant humidity, under conditions that killed regularly. More than 5,000 workers died during the American construction phase. The total death toll across both the French and American efforts was over 25,000 people. Stevens eventually resigned in 1907 for reasons that were never entirely explained. His replacement was George Goethals, an Army Corps of Engineers officer who ran the project with military precision through to completion. Under Goethals, the pace accelerated. The Culebra Cut deepened. The locks rose, and the dam held the construction in place. The Panama Canal was completed ahead of schedule and under budget. The total American investment by 1914 was approximately $375 million, the equivalent of roughly $12 billion today. On August 15, 1914, the SS Ancon became the first ship to make the full transit. The crossing took about 9 hours. The same journey around Cape Horn would have taken more than 6 weeks. What the canal represented in that moment was almost impossible to overstate. A country that had been split between two oceans, whose navy had needed 68 days to move a battleship from one coast to the other just 16 years earlier, had cut a passage through a continent. The strategic calculation that Theodore Roosevelt had made, the political maneuvering that had created Panama, the decade of digging and dyeing and engineering, all of it had produced 51 miles of waterway that changed the geography of global trade permanently. The engineering was extraordinary. The public health breakthrough that made it possible was more so, and now America owned it. The canal opened in August 1914, and almost immediately, the question of what America had actually built became more complicated than a feat of engineering. The Haibunau-Varilla Treaty had granted the United States control of a 10-mile wide strip of land running through the center of Panama in perpetuity. What that meant in practice was that a brand new country, which had existed for less than a year before it signed the treaty, had handed a foreign power permanent sovereignty over the territory that bisected it from coast to coast. The Canal Zone became a foreign colony that split Panama in two, despite Roosevelt's declaration that no such result was intended. To create the Canal Zone, the United States removed an estimated 62,000 Panamanians living in more than 40 towns and villages in the region. A historian who later researched this period found the American records of the time claimed there was nothing in the zone but jungle. The towns, the communities, the people who had managed the Panama route for 400 years, written out of the account before the ink on the treaty was dry. What replaced them was something unlike anything else America had built abroad. The Canal Zone had its own police force, its own courts, its own judges. American laws applied, and American currency worked. The head of the Panama Canal Company was also the governor of the Canal Zone, appointed by the U.S. president, operating inside a country that had no say in how he governed. Residents didn't own their homes. They rented houses assigned by seniority within the zone. The utility companies were managed by the company. Housing, schools, hospitals, all run as a single government enterprise. One historian described it as run like a giant military base crossed with a socialist enterprise. The racial architecture of the zone was formalized from the beginning. Workers were divided into two payroll categories, gold and silver. Gold employees were white Americans. Silver employees were everyone else. The two groups attended segregated schools, used separate bathrooms, and had separate recreation facilities. That segregation was a policy encoded into the zone's administrative structure and maintained for decades. It wasn't until 1954, 40 years after the canal opened, that formal racial segregation in the zone was ended. During World War II, the United States installed as many as 100 military bases throughout Panama. After the war, Panama negotiated for most of them to leave. When they didn't, there was an uprising and most closed, but 12 U.S. military bases remained across the Canal Zone. It also housed the headquarters of U.S. Southern Command, the nerve center of American military operations across all of Latin America. It trained tens of thousands of Latin American military officers, many of whom went on to be involved in some of the region's worst atrocities, massacres, and murders. The facility, later known as the School of the Americas, opened at Fort Amador in 1946. For the Panamanians living around and adjacent to the zone, the daily reality was a foreign territory running through the heart of their country, a place with different laws, different language, different customs, where they were unwelcome as customers in the commissary stores and excluded from the society. The Canal Zone Commissary dominated supplies to passing ships, and Panamanian merchants could make no sales within Canal Zone waters. The economy of the canal flowed overwhelmingly to the American company running it. Panama received its annual annuity. The figure agreed in 1903 was $250,000 per year, a number that had made some sense when it was negotiated, but which became increasingly insulting as the canal's strategic and commercial importance grew across the decades. By the time the annuity was renegotiated in 1955, it had been raised to $1.93 million. The canal was by then handling hundreds of millions of dollars in trade annually. Panama's share of that was less than $2 million a year. What America had in the Canal Zone was, by any functional definition, a state within a state. The canal worked. American ships moved between the oceans. Global trade flowed through 51 miles of water that America controlled absolutely. Whether that control was a strategic necessity, an act of imperialism, or both simultaneously, is a question the facts lay out without resolving. After decades of America's unchallenged hegemony, Panama began to rise. The sovereignty movement in Panama didn't begin with a speech or a political party. It began with a flag. In 1962, under President Kennedy, an agreement had been reached that the Panamanian flag would fly alongside the American flag at civilian locations in the Canal Zone, a symbolic gesture, small in practical terms, but significant as an acknowledgement that the zone sat inside a sovereign nation. The agreement was made in Washington, but inside the zone, American officials completely ignored it. On January 9, 1964, a group of Panamanian students marched to Balboa High School in the Canal Zone to fly their flag next to the American one. American school officials and students harassed them, and the Panamanian flag was torn. What followed was 3 days of riots across the Canal Zone and Panama City. U.S. Army units became involved after Canal Zone police were overwhelmed. When it was over, around 22 Panamanians and 4 American soldiers were dead. Panama broke off diplomatic relations with the United States and brought a formal complaint to the Organization of American States and the United Nations. The Panamanian president called it an act of aggression, and the unfortunate day is still commemorated in Panama annually as Martyrs' Day. The riots did not begin the sovereignty movement. They accelerated something that had been building for 60 years. Every decade since has added another layer of grievance: the segregated payroll, the $250,000 annual annuity, while hundreds of millions in trade flowed through. The American governor making decisions inside Panamanian territory with no Panamanian input. The military bases that stayed after the war when Panama had asked them to leave. A later Panamanian leader, General Omar Torrijos, would describe U.S. control of the canal as a foreign flag piercing its own heart. The Johnson administration opened negotiations after 1964. The Nixon administration continued them. Neither produced an agreement. The gap between what Panama demanded, genuine sovereignty, and what the American political system was willing to concede kept the talks from landing. Inside the United States, the canal had become something beyond a piece of infrastructure. It was a symbol of American capability and power. The thing Roosevelt had built, the project that had proven America could do what France could not, the waterway that moved American ships and American trade and projected American strength. Giving it away was, to a significant portion of the American public and political class, unthinkable. Jimmy Carter came to office in 1977, having previously argued against transferring the canal. In office, his assessment changed. The Cold War framing mattered here. Latin American resentment of American imperialism was becoming a genuine strategic liability. Cuba had already demonstrated that anti-American sentiment in the region could produce outcomes deeply damaging to U.S. interests. Panama was not a military threat to America, but a Panama that turned hostile or that invited Soviet or Cuban influence into the Canal Zone was a problem of a different order. Carter concluded that the canal was no longer as vital to U.S. strategic interests as it had been, and that failure to reach an agreement with Panama would jeopardize America's political and economic relations with all of Latin America. On September 7, 1977, Carter and Panamanian leader Omar Torrijos signed two treaties. The first stated that the canal zone would be turned over to Panama in 1979 and that full operational control of the canal itself would transfer by December 31, 1999. The second affirmed Panama's sovereignty while giving the United States the permanent right to defend the canal's neutrality. The American reaction was volcanic. The canal was not just infrastructure to the people who opposed the treaties. It was the distillation of a certain idea about what America was, a country that built things, that projected power, that didn't surrender what it had paid for and bled for. Ronald Reagan, campaigning for the Republican nomination, made the canal a rallying point. His line, that the canal was ours and we should keep it, drew the loudest applause of his stump speech. Polls showed the majority of the American public opposed the treaties. Conservative voices in Congress called it a capitulation, a surrender, an act of weakness that would invite challenges to American power everywhere. The Senate ratified both treaties by a single vote margin above the required two-thirds threshold. It was one of the closest and most bitterly contested treaty ratifications in American history. Carter spent enormous political capital pushing it through and never fully recovered from the backlash. It contributed to the atmosphere of weakness and retreat that Reagan would campaign against successfully in 1980. Carter's decision to give it away was either strategic genius or a costly mistake, depending on which half of the ledger you weigh more heavily. The transfer proceeded. From 1979 to 1999, both American and Panamanian flags flew at all civilian and military outposts, while the two countries managed a careful, structured transition. On December 31, 1999, Panama assumed full control of the canal. The handover was orderly, the canal kept running, and the fears of those who had argued Panama couldn't manage it proved unfounded. Panama ran the canal well, better by some measures than the Americans had. And the story that had begun with a Panamanian flag being torn at a high school in 1964 ended with Panama's flag flying alone over something it had waited nearly a century to own. Since the transfer, the canal has kept running, but the question of who it belongs to and who has influence over it is now more complicated. Panama took control of the canal on December 31, 1999, and the predictions of those who said it couldn't manage it evaporated almost immediately. The Panama Canal Authority ran the waterway efficiently, transparently, and profitably. The canal that American skeptics had warned would fall into disrepair under Panamanian management became, under Panamanian management, more productive than it had ever been. By 2016, the canal had generated around $10 billion in direct income for Panama since the handover, accounting for roughly 40% of the country's GDP. But the canal was facing a problem the original builders hadn't anticipated. The ships were getting too big for it. Container shipping had transformed global trade across the second half of the 20th century, and the vessels carrying those containers had grown steadily larger with every decade. By the 2000s, the largest ships in the world couldn't fit through the original locks built in 1914 to handle the vessels of 1914. Panama was watching billions in potential revenue sail around its canal because the canal wasn't wide enough. In 2006, Panama put the question of expanding the canal to a national referendum. Voters backed the third set of locks project, a $5.25 billion expansion that would add an entirely new lane of traffic, with locks wide enough and deep enough to handle the new generation of megaships. Construction took nearly a decade. The new locks accommodated vessels up to 1,200 feet long and 160 feet wide, nearly 3 times the cargo capacity of the original locks. The expansion effectively doubled the canal's throughput capacity. The expanded canal opened in June 2016. The first ship through was Chinese-owned. 30,000 people watched. 8 heads of state attended. The expansion was a genuine achievement. Panama, a country of 4 million people, had financed and delivered one of the most significant infrastructure projects of the 21st century on time and largely on budget. The canal that America had built was now being expanded by the country America had helped create without American involvement, and it worked. Then the rain stopped. The Panama Canal doesn't run on fuel, it runs on water. Each ship passage drains approximately 200,000 tons of fresh water into the ocean. That water comes from Gatun Lake, the same artificial lake created by the Gatun Dam a century ago, which is fed by rainfall in Panama's interior. In a normal year, Panama receives enough rain to keep the lake at operational levels. In an abnormal year, the entire system is exposed. 2023 marked one of the driest periods in Panama since the 1950s. Gatun Lake fell to historic lows. Canal authorities increased fees for passing ships and limited the number that could cross each day. Daily transits fell to a low of 22 ships, down from a normal average of around 36. Ships that expected to wait 3 to 5 days in queue were waiting 19. At one point, 130 vessels were sitting in line, a traffic jam visible from satellite, stretching across both approaches to the canal. The ripple effects moved through global supply chains immediately. U.S. East Coast ports saw delays. Freight rates on alternative routes surged. Companies that had built their logistics around reliable canal transit had to recalculate. The waterway that Roosevelt had described as essential to American power had demonstrated in a dry season exactly how essential it still was, and exactly how dependent that essentialness was on Panamanian rainfall. The drought eased in 2024, but the vulnerability it exposed hadn't gone anywhere. Climate projections suggest that droughts of this severity will become more frequent, not less. The same freshwater reserves that operate the locks provide drinking water for more than 2 million people, half of Panama's population. The canal's water problem is Panama's water problem, and both are getting harder to solve simultaneously as demand from shipping and demand from a growing population pull from the same source. Then there is China. Chinese firms own major port facilities at both the Pacific and Atlantic entrances to the canal. The company that held the concessions for 2 of the canal's most strategically significant ports was Hutchison Ports, a Hong Kong-based conglomerate with deep ties to the Chinese business establishment. For American strategists, the picture this created was uncomfortable. The canal itself is operated by Panama and treats all ships equally, American, Chinese, or otherwise, paying the same transparent tolls, waiting in the same queues. But the ports at each end, the infrastructure that ships use before and after the transit, were controlled by a company with Chinese ownership. In his inaugural address in January 2025, Donald Trump told the world he wanted the Panama Canal back. He accused Panama of charging American ships excessive fees, claimed China was secretly running the canal, and said the United States would not rule out using force to reclaim it. Panama's president responded that the canal was and would remain Panamanian. Panama took the issue to the United Nations Security Council, and it has remained a geopolitically charged issue ever since. The posturing is one thing, but the political energy behind it pointed to a real problem. There is genuine unease in American strategic circles about Chinese infrastructure presence at a choke point that $270 million worth of American-linked trade passes through every single day. In 2024, Panama's comptroller initiated a comprehensive audit of Hutchison's port concession after irregularities were uncovered in its extension. In February 2025, Panama also withdrew from China's Belt and Road Initiative, and BlackRock acquired an 80% stake in those port operations in a $22.8 billion deal. What is not in dispute is the basic arithmetic. 6% of all global maritime trade passes through the Panama Canal. The U.S. remains the canal's largest customer, as about 75% of the cargo passing through originates in or is destined for the United States. But a canal that America helped create is no longer under its control. More than a century after its construction, the Panama Canal is once again becoming a geopolitical flashpoint. Will Panama hold off American pressure, or does this have potential to turn into another Hormuz situation? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, check out our video on the line, the greatest mega disaster in history. Thanks for watching and keep following Signum for more.